大家好，我叫杜 Jenny. Hello everyone, my name is Jenny, and today we're going to be talking about the Silk Road. The short introduction to the Silk Road is that it's not just one route, or even a physical route. It's actually the name of a network of routes that stretched from China in the east all the way to the Mediterranean. The Chinese name for the Silk Road is 丝绸之路. 丝绸之路. And it spans roughly 4,000 miles. That's longer than the continental US. It started in the Han Dynasty during the 2nd century BC to the Ming Dynasty, which is where it ended in the mid-15th century AD. Now the first name that we're going to be learning today is Zhang Qian, who is known as the father of the Silk Road. This is him kneeling on the left here. And it's because his initial journey to the west is what eventually laid the foundations for the Silk Road that we know today. So during the Han Dynasty, Emperor Wu had a problem. There was a hostile nomad group to the north occupying this area. They were called the Xiongnu. And he desperately needed allies to fight against this nomad tribe. So he sent Zhang Qian to the west to find allies. Zhang Qian failed. He did not find allies. But he became an important asset because he found and began to understand and brought back knowledge of the people to the west, the geography to the west, customs and goods of the people to the west. And among those things, the most important one was the Tianma, heavenly horses. These horses were far superior to the Han horses. They were faster, they were stronger, and the emperor wanted them so badly he fought 2 wars just to get them. After this, the West became seen as possible trade partners, places to get goods, places to get horses, and the Silk Road route foundations was laid. After the Han Dynasty was the Three Kingdoms period, and during this time we see a decrease in the use of the Silk Road. And this kind of trend we will see over and over again. At one point, people will use it a lot, and the next they won't use it as much. The height of the Silk Road trade and cultural exchange was during the Tang Dynasty. This was an era of prosperity, innovation, and openness, one of China's golden ages. It was a cosmopolitan nation with both Western and Eastern influences, and we can see that specifically through women's clothing and how they changed. This is also where we have the first use of promissory notes as paper money. These were basically fancy IOUs, where merchants would write out on a piece of paper, I owe you this specific amount of money, and then they could bring that slip to the capital of Chang'an and redeem it for money. However, the paper slips could be exchanged as is, and they would still hold their value. So it was on this kind of concept that paper money was developed later. This is also the time when the monk Xuanzang brings back the Buddhist Sanskrit text from India, brings them back to China, translates them into Chinese. And it was this monk and his journey to the west, to India, that inspired the great Chinese novel, Journey to the West. During the Song Dynasty, there is an increased use of the maritime Silk Road, so the Silk Road by sea. There is a decreased use in the overland routes, though, and that's because they didn't have complete control over the land routes, so it wasn't as safe. Another reason for this is because at this point they were starting to develop more technology, like the compass, which made traveling by sea easier. They had better navigation tools than they did in the past. That doesn't mean that sea travel was without its own problems, though. For sea travel, you needed to wait for monsoon winds. You couldn't just set off whenever you wanted to, otherwise you'd be stuck. You needed to wait for those winds to blow you from one place to another. It was also during the Song Dynasty that paper money became government issued, so an official government currency. During the Yuan Dynasty is a significant change. Unlike the past dynasties, like the Tang, the Song Dynasty, those were ruled by the Han ethnic majority. This one was ruled by the Mongol ethnic minority. And under them came a time known as Pax Mongolica, or Mongol peace. This is because the Mongols managed to unite and very big amount of land. So China, the places to the north, places to the west, all under Mongol rule, made it safe to travel the land routes again because they were all under Mongol jurisdiction. The Mongols revived the land routes, and they supported the trade on those land routes and also of merchants, not just because of the goods that they brought, but also because they brought information of other countries, and they valued that information. The famous traveler Marco Polo from Venice in Italy, he was sponsored by the Mongol government, and he traveled the Silk Route during this time, and he writes about paper money in the records of his travels because he had never seen that before. Like I said earlier, the Ming Dynasty is where we start to see the decline and eventually the death of the Silk Road as we know it. And this is happening both because of things on the western side and on the eastern side. So let's take a look at what was happening in Europe first. So already by the 6th century AD, so this is much earlier than the Ming Dynasty, production of silk was already happening in Europe. Before this, it was a highly guarded secret. You could only get silk in China. So some people didn't like that. And Byzantine monks were sent to smuggle silkworms from China to Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul in Turkey. And after that, Constantinople became the center for silk production in Europe. Chinese silk did remain better quality and still in demand, but not as much, because now they were able to produce it closer, and they didn't have to travel it as far. They didn't have to bring it as far along the silk routes, so it was cheaper. Another thing that was happening here was the search for new routes. This is also because the Europeans, finally had access to new navigation tools like the compass. They also wanted to find a more profitable route than over land routes, because the way that things got transported over the land routes was not just by one person taking it along the entire way. Remember, this route is longer than the continental US. One person was not traveling all of that. Instead, what would happen is one merchant would bring a good to a certain spot, sell it to another merchant for a higher price. That merchant would take it farther, sell it to another merchant for an even higher price, so on and so forth until it reached the end of the Silk Road. So that meant if someone bought something in China, transported it to Europe, by the time it got to Europe, it was extremely expensive. And on top of that price, sometimes they even had to pay taxes. So they didn't want to do that anymore, which is kind of what prompted the production of silk happening in Europe. But it also prompted the search for new routes so they could bypass those high prices, bypass those taxes. This is what prompted Christopher Columbus in 1492 to set sail across the Atlantic, hoping to find India. The start of the Ming Dynasty in China and the end of the Ming Dynasty in China were very different. Let's see how different they were. So at the beginning, China was they had a very global mindset. They were really open to foreign influence and making connections with people. So much so that a eunuch named Zheng He was sent by the emperor with a treasure fleet. Now these ships were massive and filled with things like silk and porcelain and gold, with the intention of visiting different countries and seeing if any of them were willing to become tributary states of China. So he went as far west to Somalia, the Horn of Africa. He is still respected in some of these places that he visited, by the way, especially Indonesia and Malaysia. Now, if the countries did agree to become tributary states, they gave him things like ostriches, zebras, lions, leopards, camels, Persian rugs, ivory, spices, wool, medicine, and more. But one of the most significant things that he brought back was actually a giraffe. This is because giraffes were thought to be Tianins, mythical beings that only appeared during the arrival or the death of a great leader. So this was great news for the emperor, who was very much not dead. However, Zheng He dies in the 1430s, and so does the last emperor that supports the treasure fleet missions. After this, the Ming adopt a isolation policy. They want to focus on self-sufficient and less influence from outside forces. So this is where we see the death of the Silk Road as we know it. Now during this time, the Chinese were exporting things, pushing out things like silk, jade, porcelain, tea, and spices. They were importing, bringing in things like horses, glassware, textiles, so like fabrics, ivory, gold, precious stone, and spices. Spices is on there twice. You might be wondering, why is everyone so obsessed with spices? Why are they so important? Why do they matter so much? You have to remember, at this point in time, spices were the luxury. They were worth their weight in gold. You might have some sitting in your kitchen right now, and you might not even think twice about it, but back then, everybody wanted to get their hands on spices and the spice trade, because that would make them rich, and having it would mean that they are definitely 100% rich. Another thing that was happening and being exchanged between the West and East here is technology. So you remember that compass I told you about? This was the first compass ever invented in China. It looked like a spoon on top of a square, a plank, I guess. And eventually it evolved into the arrow pointing north that we all know of today. Another trade that was happening was the slave trade. Slaves were not the main things being traded on the Silk Road, but it was still happening. However, the Silk Road was not just about goods. It wasn't just about items. It was about relationships, diplomacy, and shared survival. So they were exchanging things like languages, diseases, religion, especially Buddhism and Islam, and the respective art forms for those two religions. And culinary spices. Cannot stress this enough. Spices. The place where this ancient globalization was happening were at places called the Yizhan, or caravanserai. These were post houses for rest, message delivery, and storage. So this is where the merchants were interacting with each other on the daily. This is where that interaction was happening. Now you remember how I said the Silk Road died? Well, it revived as the New Silk Road. At least the idea, the concept. And it's also called the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, or One Belt, One Road. Yidai, Yilu. The belt in the name refers to overland rail and road corridors, and the road refers to maritime shipping routes, so by sea. This initiative was inspired by the ancient Silk Road's role in global connection and began in 2013. The goals, at least globally, are to use trade to boost economy, develop infrastructure, strengthen bonds with other countries, and China's specific goals are to develop their western regions because they're less developed than their eastern coastal regions, and to also increase China's global significance. So this is a map of all of the countries that are members of this initiative, over 140, and a lot of these countries have historic friendships with China. Some of them were the countries that they traded with back in the ancient days on the Silk Road. So before, back in the ancient days, they had camels, traveled on foot, maybe by ships. Today, they have the China Railway Express. These are freight trains that connect Xi'an to Europe in about 12 to 18 days. And another great benefit for this is that these political agreements between different countries help to ease custom restrictions, increase shipping speed, lower taxes and tariffs, and to make borders more accessible. So that's kind of fighting some of the issues that they had with the ancient Silk Road. You know, the bringing things along the Silk Road and they get increasingly more expensive. This is a way to fight against that. In the past, China was trading things like silk, porcelain, gold. Now they sell things like electronics, machinery, cars, fashion, and films. However, modern roads and railways follow many of the same paths as the ancient routes, so they see some similar problems. One of those is shifting sands, or sandstorms. One way that they're dealing with this is by planting grids of grass in the desert to keep that sand settled. 如果你去中国，你想去哪个城市？ If you went to China, what cities would you want to visit? If I went to China, 我想去东航. I absolutely want to visit Crescent Lake, which is a crescent-shaped lake, obviously in the middle of the desert, kind of like an oasis. The Mogao Caves, these are filled with Buddhist art, and the portrait of Zhang Qian at the very beginning, that's also located in the Mogao Caves, so also some historical artwork is located there. And also the Singing Sand Dunes. It gets their name because when the sand goes down the dune, it makes a sound. Another city in Gansu province that I would like to visit is Lanzhou. Lanzhou, famous for their beef noodles. I haven't had these yet, but I want to so badly, and what better place to get them than where they originated. Lanzhou is also famous for the White Pagoda Mountain and the Shui Mo Danxia, which is a scenic area that looks like it's been painted with watercolor. In Xinjiang, I would want to visit Tulufan. This is where they grow a lot of grapes, because Xinjiang is famous for their grapes. I would want to visit Huoyanshan, or Flaming Mountains. This mountain is also very famous because it also appears in the novel Journey to the West. This is where Princess Iron Fan lives, and she uses her iron fan to fan the flames of Iron Mountain and refuses to let the Monkey King pass. So, and it's also very pretty. And if you go here, you can also visit the Bezeklik Thousand Buddha Caves. So, more Buddhist artwork. If you're more interested in Islamic art or architecture, then maybe Kashmir would be the place for you, because you can see more Islamic architecture influence here, like in this mausoleum. Besides tourism, how else has the Silk Road influenced us today? What better way to see that than by analyzing some specific countries and seeing how they have changed because of Silk Road influence. So first, let's look at Japan. During the Tang Dynasty, they sent out envoys, known as kentoshi. These envoys brought back Buddhist scriptures, Chinese-style bureaucracy, Chinese calendar, feng shui, matcha, and Chinese architecture styles. Today, if you go to Japan, you absolutely have to try their matcha because they are famous for it. Even though matcha originated in China, Japan is much more well known for their matcha. In China, Sichuan cuisine is famous for the hot, spicy, numbing, and also for peppers, red pepper. But red pepper is indigenous to the Americas. So that means it couldn't make its way to Sichuan and create that hot, numbing taste that we all know and love without the Maritime Silk Road, because they needed to bring those peppers from the Americas across the seas, across the ocean, to China, to Sichuan. Finally, we can also look at Korea, where the term for giraffe is kirin. This is derived from Qilin, that mythical being that only appears when a great leader arrives or dies. So, because the Chinese thought that it was a Qilin, they kind of brought that term over to Korea, where now giraffes in modern-day Korea are called kirin. So this is where that word originates from. So as we can see, the Silk Road began as a trade route, but it also became a path for ideas, cultures, and cooperation that still affects our lives today. That is it for this presentation. I hope you enjoyed learning about the Silk Road. I'll see you next time. 再见.